Hi everyone, happy Memorial Day weekend. It is Friday at about 2:30 and I wanted to talk with you a little bit about what school might look like this coming fall. I know that it's been a rough couple of months for a lot of you homeschooling parents, and I just wanted to say congratulations. You are either done as of this week or you are definitely approaching the finish line. And just as you are celebrating and looking into summer break, here I am talking to you about school in the fall already, which is still 3 months away. But the CDC released some guidelines on school this past week, and I thought that I would cover a little bit about that. But before I start, I wanted to give a huge thank you to two groups of people. Number one is our teachers, our administrators, our therapists, like those providing speech therapy, OT, and PT, as well as all of our school staff. A little over 2 months ago, you guys were asked to make some massive changes to your day-to-day business, basically at the drop of a hat. And you absolutely rose to the occasion. You served our kids, you figured it out, and we are so grateful for everything that you have done and that you will continue to do to make our kids' lives better and more enriched. I also want to say congratulations to all of you parents out there, because you have pushed through some seriously hard times, tears and frustration that has been created because of distance learning. I'm sure it's caused far more stress than you would have ever thought it was going to a few months ago, but you did it, and hopefully summer is going to be a little bit easier for you. So in terms of homeschooling for the fall, I want to start out by saying that I am not a teacher or an administrator. I am a pediatrician, so I don't have experience in terms of running a classroom or running a school for that matter. I'm going to do my best to kind of give you a medical perspective from a pediatric point of view, but without overstepping my bounds. So there was this 60-page CDC document that was released about opening America back up again. And I know there was a lot of concerns when it came to what schools will look like, and there's been a lot of graphics and shareables that are putting a lot of fear into people. Some parents feel like it's comparing schools to a prison, or saying it's even these guidelines are going to make school worse than a prison. Others are worried about the mental health of our kids and how school being so different will negatively impact them. And others still worry that maybe these guidelines aren't enough and that our kids may not be safe, and they are thinking about homeschooling their kids until a later point in time, maybe until we have a vaccine or a treatment. So I'm going to talk about the guidelines in just a moment, but I want to start by saying I think guidelines are a good thing. You know, when this shelter-in-place order first came into being, there was very little in terms of guidelines. And so some people took that term, shelter in place, very literally and almost didn't leave their home for an entire month. And others drank bleach, and others continued to do everything that they were doing before the shelter-in-place order went into place. And many of us were really confused on what was appropriate. What should we be doing? What shouldn't we be doing? And so while the guidelines that the CDC put forth sometimes seem extreme, at least there are some universal precautions in place for administrators and teachers to work with and to mold into their specific schools and classrooms without just randomly having to guess as to what they should be doing, and then having a lot of variability from classroom to classroom or school to school. And these guidelines have to be taken with a grain of salt, implemented based on what's feasible and what's practical, specifically tailored to each community and each school. So again, this is where our teachers and our administrators are going to have a very important role in terms of what's implemented and what's not. I do want to express that I think we all know that schools are a hub for germs. Without fail, it's usually about 7 school days after school resumes, whether it's from summer break, after Thanksgiving, winter break, spring break, that we see an influx of just routine pediatric illnesses in my office. It can be cough, cold, runny nose, it can be stomach bugs, it can be skin rashes, but it's always kind of that 7-day mark that it seems like things get really busy. And that's not surprising because you've put, millions of kids throughout the nation together in a relatively small space, and they share their germs. So honestly, I think that by having kids back in school, it is going to be inevitable to prevent some degree of spreading this virus within schools. It's going to happen, but we have to try our best to minimize how much of that happens. And while we know that the rates of severe infection in children is incredibly low, and there's only been about 200 cases of that pediatric inflammatory syndrome reported as of yet, those numbers tend to not matter when we're talking about our own kids. As I had mentioned in my previous video, I could tell you there's a 99% survival rate of something, but when it comes to your own child, you don't care anymore because you worry, what if your child is that 1%? And so these guidelines have been put in place so that we don't have to have those worries, so that we can protect our kids and we can protect their teachers as well. And so what do the guidelines say? Well, they first start off by just differentiating between low, moderate, and high-risk activities. Low risk being completely virtual, which we know is probably not going to happen in the fall, and that is okay. I think our kids do need to get back into a school setting with other individuals. Moderate risk is small groups, where the class basically stays with the same teacher and the groups or the classes don't mix. Students would ideally stay 6 feet apart, and they don't share a lot of their school items or their food. High-risk activities are more like full-size classes or events where kids are very close together, where the classes are mixing, perhaps at recess or assemblies, and there's a lot of sharing of school supplies. Now, the guidelines remind us that this virus is primarily transmitted through respiratory droplets, which are released into the air by talking, sneezing, and coughing. These droplets, when inhaled by another individual, can then cause the virus in that other individual. To a lesser degree, we worry about the virus being spread when hands touch contaminated surfaces, and then those hands touch our mouth or our nose. So the guidelines are aiming to help decrease the spread of those respiratory droplets and help to decontaminate surfaces. So first and foremost, I think the most important guideline that they present is for our kids, as well as the teachers, to stay home when they are sick. Now, I think we have all been guilty, myself included, of sending our kids to school some days when they just don't look right, but with hopes that they'll be fine. And then you get a call from the school within a few hours that they're not doing very well, or maybe they have a fever, and you have to come and pick them up. This year, particularly this fall, is going to be a time when we need to act on the side of caution. If your kiddos don't look well, we need to keep them home. And I know this is very difficult for a lot of you in terms of work, but at the same time, there's so much more at risk than just transmitting a simple cold. And I do agree that schools may need to have some degree of leniency when it comes to this. Funding for a lot of our public schools is dependent on how many kids are in school on any given day. And so if parents are going to be willing to keep their sick kids home, then perhaps schools may also need to not necessarily have a doctor's note every single time the kiddo is staying home from school being sick. And again, that comes into funding and lots of very intricate dynamics that I don't know too much about, but again, something that we have to work our way through so that parents feel comfortable keeping their kids home when they are sick, but also don't feel like they've got to drag their kids to the doctor's office just to get a note saying they're cleared and they can come back. This probably is not the year to have perfect attendance awards, because I know there's a lot of kids, it means a lot to them, and they try their best and they really want to go to school. And there will be a time and a place when we can re-implement these awards, but again, I don't know if this fall is the time to do that. And I think that teachers may be able to speak a little bit better to this, but there may need to be an option to have daily virtual learning for those kids that quite honestly get sick a lot. You know, you've got your kids that almost never get colds, and then you've got others that are just from November to March, they're just constantly snotty, and their parents may do their due diligence and allow them to stay home, but we want to make sure that they continue to learn. And again, what is really up for discussion is if your child comes into close contact with a confirmed case of COVID-19, you may not send them to school for 14 days. That is a serious implication, again, for the child's learning, as well as for working parents. So there's still a lot up in the air when it comes to that, but I just bring it to you so that we can at least plant that seed and think about what we're going to do next fall. Number 2 is hand washing and the use of hand sanitizers. The guidelines call for more stations, more supplies, more reminder signs, as well as reminders through announcements over the PA system. Reminding kids to wash their hands after they use a tissue and not to reuse that tissue or hold on to a tissue, because kids like to do that. But again, this requires that we have adequate supplies. And 2.5 months into this thing, you and I can't even get Clorox wipes just at the store for our families. So how will we supply, thousands of schools across the nation with this? How can we ask parents to bring them in for their own child if we can't get them yet? So again, there's so much to be determined, but this is what the guideline is calling for. And I do think it would be ideal if obviously we had more hand washing stations, because we know that that's what's going to prevent spread, and to have more hand sanitizer, to have more Clorox wipes to help decontaminate surfaces. But production is going to have to increase, and that might be a lot more trickier than said. Number 3, cloth face coverings for all students over the age of 2, as well as for all staff. And I know this is going to be absolutely one of the biggest points of contention. So let's talk about the pros and cons of kids wearing masks. The pros are that we can have a little bit less reliance on having the kids stay 6 feet apart from one another on their own. And of course, we're going to have less spread of potentially infected germs, because when you wear a cloth face covering or a mask, your respiratory droplets are less likely to spread through that to other people. Less spread means fewer cases in kids, and that means fewer kids out of school and fewer parents out of work. But then it brings up this question of, what do you do when a child does test positive? Does the whole classroom have to quarantine for 14 days? Will all of the parents of all of the classmates have to take 14 days off of work? Well, the textbook answer is yes, because we're trying to diminish spread, but the practical answer really remains to be determined. And I think you have to really think, how are you going to feel when that letter comes home that says that your child has been exposed to COVID-19? It's a very different feeling than when you get that letter that says that your child's been exposed to pink eye, right? And I think some parents will say, that's it, I'm going to keep the kids home for 14 days. I don't want to encounter that risk. And others may say, I don't have a choice. Unless my child is sick, I have to send him to school. So again, there's a lot that we have to think about. But again, the fewer cases that we have, the less likely this is going to happen. And I have been seeing kids wearing masks in my office now for well over a month. And I will tell you that, yes, there are so many that are constantly touching their face and so on and so forth, but they adjust, and they really do start to wear it when they see that everybody else is wearing it. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. I think another reason why there's some stigma here with the masks is that we associate masks with being sick, like really sick. So when we see our kids in masks, it triggers an emotion, the same emotion that we would feel if our kids were sick, and we don't like it. So that's why we start to fight it, and we say that our kids shouldn't have to wear masks. But listen, folks, our kids have all gone through phases where they didn't like to wear their diapers, they didn't like to keep their pants on, their socks, or their shoes. But we figured it out as parents. We showed them that it's important to wear these things, or to wear underwear instead of their diapers. And gradually they adjusted. And they've worn all those important items of clothing to school every single day, because we showed them that it's important and we set an example for them. So I do think that our kids can adjust over time if we allow them to adapt and we set the right example as parents. Now, to be fair, let's discuss the cons of wearing masks. Obviously, there's that social stigma that I just talked about, and that social stigma may also cause some adverse mental health effects on our kids. They may not like to see all of us in masks, But again, if the kids see that all of their friends are in masks, their parents are in masks, then they're going to start normalizing it. It's just another way to teach our kids to be part of the solution. We do know that masks tend to make us touch our face a little bit more, but what I've noticed for myself is that the longer I've worn the masks, the less likely I am to touch my face because I've just gotten used to it. The other issue we worry about is obviously not being able to breathe well in masks. And this is why I encourage you to play around with different masks this summer. Find a style for your child that stays on and fits well, so they're not constantly messing with it. It's not moving up over their eyes. It's not coming down over their nose, but one that they feel comfortable in. Have them first wear it for a half hour in the house and see how they do. And if they say, gosh, Mom, I can't breathe in this thing, it doesn't mean don't ever try it again, but maybe it means look for a new style, or maybe it means just do short increments with that mask until they get used to it, and then they can start to wear it for a longer time. I will tell you that my N95 that I wear when I am directly seeing patients is incredibly constricting, and I actually take it off, almost rip it off every time I come out of the patient's room, and I put on just a regular surgical mask. And the difference between the two is that a regular surgical mask breathes so much better. I don't encourage any of you to exercise in it, but quite honestly, with a regular surgical mask, I could spend a lot of time in it, and it's because I've gradually adjusted to it over time. And what you guys are looking for when it comes to these cloth coverings is something that's going to catch most of your child's spit and snot. It does not have to be skin tight. It does not have to be medical grade. I think the home seamstresses and Etsy have done amazing jobs with amazing styles. And a lot of the kids I've seen in the office have started to think it's kind of fun because they can pick the patterns that they're wearing. So again, don't wait until August 12th to figure this out. If our schools are going to require our children to wear masks, let's be proactive about it now. Let's set a good example. Let's make it fun for our kids so they can pick out different types of styles and patterns that they like. Talk to your friends about what masks have worked well for their kids, and then purchase a few and see how it goes over the summer. I know this is a harsh reality, but what I'm going to say is that the more responsive that you are to this change, the more responsive that your kids are going to be to this change. All religious beliefs aside, if you look at the evolution of both human and animal species to date, the ones who are the most willing to adapt are the ones who survive. And we're sort of in a similar situation right now. Digging your heels into the ground about how none of this is necessary is not going to help your kids. It's not going to help our teachers. It's not going to help our schools, and it's not going to help you. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the other guidelines. There is a lot, so I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. Frequent disinfection of commonly touched surfaces, and again, this will be dependent on supplies. Not sharing of school supplies as well as water fountains. Having each child use their own designated supplies. Everything from pencils, paintbrushes, books, electronics, you name it. Ensuring adequate ventilation and as much outdoor air as possible. And again, this one would be tricky for us here in Bakersfield because in August you cannot have the windows open. It's going to be over 100 degrees, right? Desks should ideally be 6 feet apart. And again, I know this will be difficult in impacted schools, or at the very least facing the same direction, which I think is how a lot of us went to school, right? Increasing the distances on school buses. So they have recommended 1 child per row and skipping rows. But this takes down the number of kids in a school bus to 1/4 of what it was previously. And obviously, I don't know if we have funding or the feasibility to, get that many more buses or have our drivers running that route 4 times to get kids to school on time. But again, it's a guideline and we'll work with what we can. Staggering drop-off and pickup times, which I think actually would be nice because I have seen the drama that drop-off sometimes invokes, and perhaps if the kids were starting and stopping at different times, this would make life easier. Physical barriers like sneeze guards or the plexiglasses that you're seeing in businesses in between the children, or when 6 feet apart is not possible, like at the reception desks in the office or with the teachers' desks. Perhaps physical guides on the ground like tape to help kids remember where to stand, because I know even when I'm trying to stand 6 feet away from people, sometimes I gradually start to move closer. closure of communal shared spaces like the cafeteria or the playgrounds. And I know that's a hard one to swallow because our kids need recess, but an alternative is to stagger the use of those cafeterias and playgrounds and perhaps disinfect in between the use. Again, this comes into staffing. That's a lot of disinfecting, that's a lot of supplies, and that's a lot of people that you need to be doing that process. So something we have to take into account. As much as possible, having kids bring their own food to school. But again, we know that a lot of our kids rely on school breakfast and school lunch to get what calories they can on a daily basis. When the school does offer food, perhaps plating the food in the classrooms as opposed to in the cafeteria, avoiding buffet style or family style meals at events. Limiting visitors to classrooms, including parents who work outside or who are just not part of the regular school staff on a daily basis. And pursuing virtual options when it comes to club meetings, assemblies, performances, parent-teacher conferences, etc. There are tons more guidelines when it comes to staffing, communication, sick leave, how to handle sick patients, but I'm not going to go into all of those. I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of what may be applicable to you and your child come August and September. So obviously that is a lot of guidelines. Are all of our kids going to follow this to a T? Absolutely not. I can tell you with certainty that that's not going to happen. In fact, I took my son to school to say goodbye to his teacher 2 days ago, and I didn't even have a mask for him, so I used a bandana, and he was a hot mess, just all over the place, taking it off, this and that. But what that taught me is that I have some work to do with him this summer. Rather than just throwing my hands up in exasperation because we had one 20-minute session where he couldn't stop messing with his face covering, it taught me maybe I need to order a few and find out what's going to work for him. I know that the younger kids, this is going to be more and more of a problem, but I saw that my daughter, who's 10, she did great. Like, she kept it on. She didn't have a problem. And there's a lot of kids who are ages 10 to 18 that are in school that I think can handle this. And we may need to rely on them as opposed to the younger kids in terms of social distancing and things of that nature. And what I will say is maybe we implement these guidelines and maybe only a half or a fourth of it is implemented. But perhaps that's all we need in order to keep things manageable with this virus, but still keep our kids in school. You may have read recently that France had to close schools relatively soon after opening them back up. And I personally think it would be better to start off a little over the top, if you will, and gradually release the restrictions than to start off with just a few loose recommendations that don't even work and tell our poor kids who are so excited to go to school that we have to close again. It just wouldn't be fair to them. And we have to do our due diligence to give them a fighting chance. So that's about it in terms of guidelines. I know a lot of you still just don't feel like this virus is very dangerous, perhaps based on what you've seen here in Kern County. And I suppose in a way, we're lucky because quite honestly, not a lot of people come here on vacation. You know, Memorial Day weekend, I don't think there's a lot of people to the north or the south of us that are dying to come to Kern County, right? It tends to be us who leaves to those other locations. And we have the blessing of being fairly spread out in this county. And I think that is why we've had fewer number of cases here, but they still continue to rise, and so do the deaths. So we need to be cognizant of what is happening around us. And quite honestly, if you look at a national level, we have some work to do. We're at about 95,000 deaths since this started. Let's say January 1st, just to give the benefit of the doubt to the naysayers. That's more than all of the Americans that died in the Vietnam War over 10 years. One of our most recent worst flu seasons, which was 2017 to 2018, killed somewhere between 60 and 80,000 people over the course of a year, and we've surpassed that already. And there's no sign that this virus is fading out. You know, our temperatures are getting warmer, flu season is essentially over, and yet we still keep having more cases. And sometimes it feels like it's almost picking up speed as we hear about new cases every day. Granted, there are many recoveries every day, which is a good thing. And we're just starting to learn that, our kids are getting this new pediatric inflammatory syndrome. 20 to 40-year-olds are having heart attacks and strokes. We see that this virus is not just a respiratory illness, but it's affecting people's brains, their sense of smell, their lungs, their heart, their gastrointestinal system, their skin. And we don't have a treatment, we don't have a vaccine, and we are smashing through these phases like it's nobody's business. So let's try to do our due diligence and not be so pessimistic about what school is going to look like in the fall. Remember that our kids are so incredibly resilient and they are watching us to the T. So let's show them that we can adapt to this situation and they can too. This is not an easy task when it comes to school to figure out what is the right answer and the wrong answer. And I am not envious of our teachers and our administrators who are going to have to implement this. But let's continue to support them in this process the same way we did in these last 2 months when we realized how hard their job really is. All right, so that's it, you guys. I know that was a lot of talking. Welcome to summer. Enjoy it before we tackle school in the fall. Have a wonderful Memorial Day weekend. Please be safe, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.